somewhere in the Arctic, in a cold bay north of Russia. There are nuclear submarines lying half sunk in the water like dead whales. Together, they hold the equivalent of 6.5 Hiroshima bombs. Nobody is in a hurry to move them. This is a list of 7 places in Europe where someone built something enormous, something expensive, something secret, something that was supposed to win a war, and then walked away. 7 graveyards left behind by a war that never came. 6 of them were built for that war. One of them is what happens when peace itself becomes the killer. That is where we are starting. Number 7. The cruise ship graveyard at Aliaga, Turkey. In February of 2020, the Carnival Fantasy was carrying 2,000 passengers through the Caribbean. She had been doing that since 1990, 30 years of sun decks and buffets and karaoke nights. 6 months later, she was on a beach in Turkey, being cut into scrap metal by men with torches. She was not alone. The inspiration arrived a few weeks after her, then the imagination, then the Sovereign, which used to belong to Royal Caribbean, then the Monarch, then the Costa Victoria, then a ship called the Astor, which had sailed for 33 years, once for South African owners, once for the Soviets, once for Germans, and which was sold for $1.7 million, about the price of a small apartment in London. That the yard at Aliaga sits on a 10-kilometer stretch of coastline near Izmir. It is the 4th largest shipbreaking facility in the world and the largest in Europe. In a normal year, it dismantles a few dozen old freighters and ferries. In 2020, business jumped by 30%. Drone photographs taken in October of that year show 5 luxury cruise liners side by side, beached at low tide, half disassembled. On one of them, you can still see the swimming pool. It is still full. The water is still blue. On another, there is a miniature golf course on the upper deck. The grass is still bright green. On a third, the famous Carnival red funnel is almost all that is left of the ship. The rest has already been cut away. The men who work at Aliaga use a method called landing. They drive the ship full speed onto the beach at high tide. When the water goes out, the ship is left on the sand. Then they cut it into pieces from the bow inward, hauling each block away with cranes. It takes about a year per ship. The metal goes to recycling. The non-metal parts, the beds, the lamps, the mirrors, the carpets, the kitchen equipment, get bought by hotel operators who drive down to the yard with trucks. There are roadside motels in Turkey today that are decorated with the cabins of dead cruise ships. The cruise ships finish their lives as fittings in places that nobody from the cruise industry will ever stay. This is what happens when an industry dies in peacetime. 2 years, 15 ships, a pandemic. The rest of this video is about what happens when an industry was built for a war that never came. Number 6. The Plokstine Missile Base, Lithuania. In 1960, the Soviet Union decided to build the first underground nuclear missile silo in its history. They picked a forest in Lithuania, the westernmost republic of the USSR, the closest piece of Soviet territory to Western Europe. And they sent 10,000 soldiers to dig. The soldiers were not Lithuanian. The Soviet command did not trust the locals to keep secrets, so they brought in workers from Estonia and Kazakhstan, men who did not speak the local language and could not gossip with the villagers. Most of them dug by hand. 2 years of digging, 4 shafts, each 30 meters deep and 5 meters wide, with concrete walls 2.5 meters thick. They dug through sand, they dug through forest, and then they hit groundwater. Lake Platelii is right next to the base. As the soldiers got deeper, the water table started leaking into the shafts. Their first solution was to dig a small channel out of the lake itself, hoping to lower the water level. It did not work. They had to bring in pumps and complex drainage systems. They kept digging. 10,000 men. with hand tools. 2 years, through sand and groundwater, to dig 4 holes in the ground that would never be used. Let that sit for a moment. On the 31st of December, 1962, just before midnight, the base went operational. 4 R-12 missiles, in NATO terminology, SS-4 Sandal, were lowered into the silos. Each one was 23 meters tall, weighed more than 40 tons, and carried a 2-megaton thermonuclear warhead. And each one was more than 100 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Their targets were West Germany, Britain, Norway, Turkey, Denmark, and Spain. Missiles like these, the same model, R-12, the Russian designation Divina, would be shipped from the Soviet Union to Cuba in the autumn of 1962. They were the missiles at the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world came closer to nuclear war during those 13 days than at any other moment in history. And the same kind of missile, with the same warhead, was sitting in a forest in Lithuania the whole time, pointed at Western Europe. To launch a missile, 3 officers had to cooperate at the same time. One inserted a key and entered an 8-digit code from Moscow. The other 2 pressed 2 separate buttons simultaneously. Only then would a rocket rise out of the forest. None of them ever did. But there was one death. A soldier on a routine maintenance check, lowered down into one of the silos on a safety belt, fell to the bottom when the belt broke. He was the only person to die at the Plokstine missile base. He died in peacetime. He died for a war that never happened. The base was shut down in 1978. The missiles were taken out. The Soviet army left. And then, and this is the part I keep getting stuck on, the support buildings on the surface were converted into a children's summer camp. They called it Zuvedra, Seagull. From 1979 until 1990, Lithuanian children spent their summer holidays playing in the buildings, where Soviet officers had once practiced launching nuclear missiles. The grass they ran on was the same grass that covered 4 empty silos, each one deep enough to swallow a 10-story building. None of the children were told. The base became a museum in 2012. Today, you can stand at the edge of one of the silos and look down. It is dark. It is deep. It is cold. The guide will tell you about the soldier who fell. While the Soviets were learning how to launch nuclear missiles, they were also learning how to spot them. Number 5 is the antenna they built to listen for the apocalypse. Number 5, the Russian woodpecker. In the summer of 1976, amateur radio operators around the world started hearing something they could not explain. A sharp, repetitive tapping noise, 10 taps per second. It came in on the shortwave bands. It was extremely powerful, and it disrupted everything. Commercial broadcasts, aviation communications, ship-to-shore radio, ham radio. Pilots complained, airlines complained, governments complained. Nobody knew what it was. Someone called it the Russian woodpecker because that is what it sounded like, and the name stuck. For 13 years, the woodpecker tapped. Conspiracy theories grew up around it. Some people believed it was a Soviet mind control experiment. Some believed it was weather modification. Some believed it could destroy human brain cells. Radio enthusiasts formed a club called the Russian Woodpecker Hunting Club and tried to jam the signal back. Receiver manufacturers started building special filters into their equipment called woodpecker blankers to cancel out the noise. NATO military intelligence triangulated the source to somewhere in northern Ukraine. The Soviet Union, when asked, said it had no idea what anyone was talking about. What it actually was a radar. It was called Duga. The full name was Duga 1, and it was an over-the-horizon early warning system designed to detect American intercontinental ballistic missiles the moment they launched. Soviet calculations suggested an American missile would reach the USSR in under an hour. They needed to know the moment one was fired. The way it worked was this. A normal radar sends a beam in a straight line, which means the curve of the Earth limits how far it can see. An over-the-horizon radar bounces its beam off the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere, and uses the bounce to look around the curve of the planet. To do that, it needs an enormous amount of power, and it needs an enormous antenna. Duga was the antenna. It is 150 meters tall. It is 700 meters long. That is taller than any building in most European cities and longer than 7 football pitches. It sent out 10 megawatts of radio power, enough to be heard on every shortwave frequency in the world. It is estimated that running it consumed about a third of all the electricity produced by the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, 12 kilometers away, which is why the power plant and the antenna were built next to each other in the first place. It was extremely secret. On Soviet maps, the site was marked as a pioneer camp, a Soviet term for a children's summer camp. There is a story, not entirely confirmed, but widely repeated by people who were in Chernobyl after the disaster, that when an American journalist asked Soviet officials what the giant lattice on the horizon was, he was told it was an unfinished hotel. A 150-meter tall steel hotel in the middle of a forest with no windows and no rooms. There was a small secret city built next to the antenna called Chernobyl 2, where about 1,000 people lived. They operated the radar. They were sworn to silence. The Soviets even built a duplicate antenna, Duga 2, on the other side of the country in eastern Siberia, in case the first one failed. It almost worked. The signal had been broadcasting in test mode since 1976, but the system was never fully reliable. It could only detect a massive missile launch, not a single one, and the pulses kept drifting in frequency. Engineers were planning a final upgrade. The system was scheduled for full operational testing in 1986. On the 26th of April of that year, 12 kilometers away, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The radiation poured out across the forest, across the secret city, across the antenna. Within days, everyone was evacuated. The radar that was built to detect the end of the world was destroyed by the wrong end of the world. The crew left so fast that documents and equipment were still on the desks when they shut the doors. The signal stopped in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later. The Siberian antenna was dismantled and sold for scrap metal. The Ukrainian one is still there. It cannot be dismantled. The radiation from Chernobyl has soaked into the steel, and any attempt to take it apart would mean handling contaminated metal. So it stands, 150 meters of rusting steel in the middle of a radioactive forest, listening for missiles that nobody is going to fire. In April of 2020, a wildfire swept through the exclusion zone. The grass burned, the trees burned, the houses of Chernobyl, 2 burned, the antenna did not. If you are still here, consider subscribing. The strongest entries are still ahead. Number 3 is the one I keep thinking about, not because of what they built, because of how much of it they built. And number 1 is the answer to the question I asked at the very beginning. Number 4, Vogelsang. About an hour by train north of Berlin, in a forest in the German state of Brandenburg, there is a city. Or there was a city. Most of it has been knocked down, and the rest is being slowly torn apart by demolition machines, and the forest is moving back in. But the foundations are still there. The walls are still there. The murals are still there. There is even a statue of Lenin standing in a clearing where the main square used to be. The city was called Vogelsang. It means birdsong. At its peak, 15,000 people lived there. 550 buildings, a theater, a school, a gymnasium, 2 cafeterias, one for officers, one for soldiers, a hospital, shops, a kindergarten, apartment blocks for families. It was the third largest Soviet base in East Germany. This is the part you have to slow down for. Vogelsang was not in the Soviet Union. It was in East Germany, but the people who lived there were not German. They were Russian. They were Soviet soldiers and their wives and their children, living a self-contained Russian life behind a fence in a German forest. The local Germans did not know what was happening inside. The East German government barely knew what was happening inside because the Soviets did not tell them. In 1959, the Soviet army brought 12 nuclear missiles to Vogelsang. They were called R-5 Pobeda missiles, in NATO terminology, SS-3 Shyster. And each one carried a warhead 20 times larger than the one used at Hiroshima. Their range was 1,200 kilometers. Their targets were London and Paris. According to CIA reports from the period, the Soviets themselves estimated that 5 of these missiles would have been enough to destroy the United Kingdom. 7 to 9 would have been enough for France. They were sitting in a forest in East Germany, pointed at the capitals of 2 NATO members. The East German government was not informed. General Heinz Kessler, who was the head of the East German Air Force at the time, said in a 1999 interview that he had no idea the missiles existed. The Soviets had brought them into the country at night, on side roads, deliberately keeping the East German military out of the loop. Their own allies did not know. The soldiers at Vogelsang held their training exercises only at night to avoid being seen by American satellites. The local German villagers, the ones who lived just on the other side of the fence, were told nothing. They knew there were Russians in the forest. They did not know there were warheads. The missiles did not stay long. By August of 1959, they had been quietly removed and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Nobody is exactly sure why. The most likely reason is that Nikita Khrushchev was about to fly to America to meet President Eisenhower, and someone in Moscow decided it would be embarrassing if the Americans found out their guest had nuclear weapons pointed at their allies. So the missiles went home. Vogelsang kept running for another 35 years as a regular tank base, but the warheads were gone. When the Soviet army withdrew in 1994, they took what they could and left the rest, the barracks, the murals, the Lenin statue, the kindergarten with the children's drawings still on the walls. Brandenburg's government has been demolishing the site, building by building, ever since. They are racing the forest. The forest is winning. Vogelsang was built by a country that was afraid of one enemy. Number 3 was built by a country that was afraid of all of them. Number 3, the Bunkers of Albania. Imagine a country smaller than the state of Maryland, 3 million people, one paranoid old man at the top. His name was Enver Hoxha, and he was Albania's communist dictator from 1944 until he died in 1985. He was Stalin's most loyal student. He was, by some measures, the most isolated dictator in Europe. In 1967, Hoxha started building bunkers, small concrete domes, which about 2 meters tall, just large enough to fit one man with a rifle. The walls were 30 centimeters thick, reinforced with another 60 centimeters of packed earth and a curved outer shield. They were designed to be almost impossible to destroy. The man who designed them, Joseph Zagali, supposedly had to sit inside the prototype while Hoxha had a tank fire shells at it to prove it would survive. The prototype survived, Zagali survived, and the order went out, build them everywhere. This is where the numbers start to get strange. By 1983, Albanian government records confirmed that 173,000 bunkers had been built. That is the number we know for certain. But the goal was much higher. Hoxha wanted 1 bunker for every 4 citizens. But that works out to 750,000 bunkers. Some sources say he reached that number. Some say he did not. Nobody is entirely sure because Hoxha's regime was so secretive that even Albania's later governments did not know what had been built or where. What we know is this. In a country smaller than Maryland, with a population of a medium-sized European city, there is one bunker for roughly every 4 people, 5.7 of them per square kilometer. Whichever number you trust, 173,000 or 750,000. It is the largest bunker network ever built by any country, anywhere in human history. You see them everywhere in Albania. They sit on beaches, watching the sea. They sit in farmers' fields, between the rows of corn. They sit on hilltops, looking at the borders. They sit in city parks, where children climb on them. They sit in cemeteries, between the graves of people who died long after the bunkers were built. There is a photograph of a 2-person bunker in a graveyard in central Albania. The caption explains that it is a graveyard. The bunker is just there, like a tree. The reason there are so many is that Hoxha was afraid of everyone. He was afraid of NATO. He was afraid of the Americans. He had broken with the Soviet Union in 1961, so he was afraid of the Soviets. He had broken with China in 1977, so by the end, he was afraid of the Chinese too. He was afraid of Yugoslavia to the north, Italy across the Adriatic, and Greece to the south. Every neighbor was a potential invader. Every coastline was a potential landing site, and every hilltop needed a man with a rifle in a concrete dome. The cost was enormous. Albania was already one of the poorest countries in Europe, and Hoxha spent billions of dollars on concrete and steel for the bunkers. Concrete and steel that could have built houses or roads or hospitals. A local Albanian historian named Adamarina Pisi said it best. Hoxha enslaved an entire population to build 750,000 fortifications, she said, and history has proven that the real risk of invasion was 0. The bunkers worked exactly the way Hoxha wanted them to. The enemy never came. He probably did not come because he never existed. Hoxha died in 1985. The regime fell 7 years later. The bunkers stayed. Too many to demolish. Too solid to ignore. By 2009, because the situation on the beaches got absurd, waves had carved whirlpools around the bunker bases. Swimmers were drowning in them. So the Albanian government wheeled out old Chinese tanks and started firing on its own coastline. They shelled their own paranoia. Most of it is still there. The bunkers have other lives now. Farmers store hay in them. Teenagers use them as places to hide and drink. One beach resort on the Adriatic has a bunker dome poking up through the floor of its restaurant. The staff put the breakfast spread on top of it. In Tirana, the capital, 2 of Hoxha's personal underground command bunkers have been turned into museums called Bunk Art and Bunk Art 2. You can walk through the steel doors that were built to protect the dictator from a nuclear strike and look at art installations about the regime that built them. It is the only military graveyard in this video that the public is invited to picnic on. Number 2. Zeljava. In 1948, 3 years after Hiroshima, Marshal Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, made a decision. Yugoslavia would belong to neither side of the Cold War. Not the Soviet bloc, not NATO. Tito had broken with Stalin that year, and he was certain that someone was eventually going to invade his country. Probably the Soviets, possibly the Americans, maybe both. He needed somewhere to put his air force where nobody could destroy it. He picked a mountain. The mountain was called Pljesevica, on the border between what is now Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. He had it hollowed out. The construction took 20 years. The Yugoslav government spent the equivalent of $6 billion on the project. In today's money, about $42 billion. That is roughly 3 times the combined annual military budgets of modern Croatia and Serbia. To pay for it, Tito borrowed money from the World Bank, who believed they were funding the construction of new motorways. They were not funding motorways. They were funding the inside of a mountain. When it was finished in 1968, Object 505, that was its code name, was one of the largest underground military complexes in Europe. 3.5 kilometers of tunnels, 4 entrances, each sealed with a 100-ton pressurized steel door. 3 of those doors were big enough to fly a jet through. Inside the mountain, there was room for 2 full squadrons of fighter aircraft, about 60 MiG-21s, plus a control tower, an operations center, fuel tanks, and enough food and water for 1,000 people to live underground for a month. The whole structure was designed to survive a direct hit from a 20-kiloton nuclear bomb. That is the same size as the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. The radar tower on the mountain above could see across most of the Balkans and into the Adriatic. Yugoslav intelligence used it to monitor NATO naval movements off the Italian coast and Soviet activity to the east. The complex was supposed to be top secret. It was not very secret. Yugoslavia was in the non-aligned movement, and Tito's government quietly sold copies of the blueprints to Algeria, Iraq, and Kuwait, who wanted underground bases of their own. And NATO delegations were invited to tour the site. Civilian journalists wrote about it. The CIA had satellite photographs of the construction. It was, as one writer has put it, the most expensive secret nobody was actually keeping. For 24 years, the base ran. MiG pilots scrambled out of the mountain on training flights. The radar listened. The 100-ton doors stayed ready. Then the wars came. When Yugoslavia started to fall apart in 1991, the Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, still controlled Zeljava. They used it to launch fighter sorties against Croatia in the early months of the Croatian War of Independence. But by the spring of 1992, the JNA was being pushed back, and the base was about to fall into Croatian hands. The Yugoslav command had a problem. They could not let the most expensive military installation in the country's history be captured by their enemy. So they did the only thing they could think of. They blew it up themselves. On the morning of the 16th of May, 1992, at 7:47 in the morning, 56 tons of explosives went off inside the mountain. The order was signed by a Serbian colonel named Milan Menikanin. The blast was so powerful that residents of the nearby city of Bihać, 9 kilometers away, felt the earth shake. Smoke rose from the mountain entrances and kept rising for the next 6 months. The outer shell of the complex held. The engineering was that good. But everything inside was reduced to rubble. $6 billion, 20 years of work, $42 billion in today's money, gone in one morning. Nobody has rebuilt it. Every plan since has been blocked by political disputes or by the minefields that were laid around the base in the wars of the 1990s. Today, the Croatian police train explosive detection dogs in the perimeter. There's a single old Douglas aircraft sitting on the apron, slowly being stripped by visitors. The runway has been used for grazing sheep. $6 billion to build a mountain that could survive a nuclear strike. 56 tons of explosives to make sure no one else could have it. The mountain is still there. The hole is still there. The doors are still there, twisted and torn open, leaning at strange angles in the dark. And finally, number 1. Remember the bay from the beginning, the submarines that look like dead whales. It is time to talk about how they got there. Between 1950 and 2003, the Soviet Union built the largest nuclear-powered navy in the history of the world. 248 submarines, 4 nuclear cruisers, 9 nuclear icebreakers. 468 reactors in total, more than every other navy on the planet combined. The hub of this fleet was the Kola Peninsula, a strip of Arctic land in northwestern Russia, just east of the Norwegian border. The fjords there are deep, ice-free, and far from prying eyes. The main port was Murmansk. The repair yards were spread across smaller bases up and down the coast. When the Cold War ended, the Soviets had a problem. They had hundreds of nuclear submarines that were too old, too radioactive, or too damaged to keep using. Decommissioning a nuclear submarine is expensive. Well, you have to remove the spent fuel. You have to handle the reactor compartment. You have to dispose of the contaminated metal. The Russian Navy in the 1990s did not have the money for any of this. So they did what bureaucracies do when they cannot afford the right answer. They postponed. The submarines piled up. By the early 2000s, more than 200 decommissioned nuclear submarines were sitting at piers and moorings around Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, slowly rusting. Some had been there for a decade. Some had simply been towed into nearby coves, where the hulls floated half-submerged because nobody could be bothered to deal with them. There is a place called Nezametnaya Cove, near the town of Gadjiyevo, that you can find on satellite maps if you know what to look for. It is a graveyard. Soviet submarines be lying tilted in the shallows, their hulls split open like the rib cages of beached animals. Veterans say that as late as the 1990s, you could still walk along the shore and identify individual boats by the markings on their conning towers. At one of the storage sites, a place called Andreeva Bay, the Soviet Navy stockpiled 22,000 spent nuclear fuel assemblies from over 100 submarines. They kept them in rusting metal containers outdoors on the Arctic coast with no proper protection. In 1982, one of the storage pools sprang a leak, and 600,000 metric tons of radioactive water flowed into the Barents Sea. In 1995, an active submarine at a base near Murmansk almost suffered a meltdown because the Russian Navy had not paid its electricity bills, and the power had been cut off. But the worst story is the K-159. The K-159 was a Soviet attack submarine of the November class, the first generation of Soviet nuclear submarines, commissioned in 1963. She had a difficult career. In 1965, just 2 years into service, she suffered a leak in her reactor coolant system, and her entire propulsion plant was contaminated with radioactivity. She kept operating for another 20 years anyway. She was decommissioned in 1989, but never properly defueled. Her 2 reactors, containing about 800 kilograms of spent uranium, were left inside the hull. The hull was tied up at a base called Gremica on the eastern edge of the Kola Peninsula, and forgotten. For 14 years, she sat there, although by 2003, her hull was so corroded that she could not float on her own. The Russian Navy decided, or claimed to decide, that she finally needed to be towed to Polyarny, a shipyard on the western side of the peninsula, 350 kilometers away. To keep her afloat for the journey, they strapped 4 large, air-filled pontoons to her hull. To keep her watertight during the towing, they put 10 sailors on board, whose only job was to pump out any water that leaked in. The weather forecast for the day they planned to leave was bad. They left anyway. On the 28th of August, 2003, the K-159 and her tugboat headed out into the Barents Sea. 2 days into the journey, in the early morning hours of the 30th of August, they ran into a storm, which one of the pontoons tore loose. Then a leak opened up at the rear of the submarine, near the propeller joints. The captain of the submarine, a man named Sergei Lapa, called the tugboat by radio. He said they had a leak in compartment 9. He said they were trying to seal it. He said the water was coming in faster than they could pump it out. He suggested allowing the submarine to sink in the shallow water near a nearby island where it might be salvaged later. By 3 a.m, the K-159 had sunk to the bottom of the Barents Sea, 200 meters down. 8 of the 10 men were inside her when she went down. 2 men had managed to get out as the submarine was sinking. One of them was a senior lieutenant named Maxim Cybulski. The 2 of them spent 2 hours alone in the freezing Arctic water, holding on to each other before the tugboat crew found them. By the time the tugboat reached them, the other man was dead. Cybulski was still conscious. He was the only survivor. 2 of the bodies were recovered from the surface in the days that followed. The other 7 were never found. They are still inside the submarine, 200 meters down, with the 800 kilograms of uranium in the reactors. The Russian defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, flew to the hospital in Severomorsk to visit Cybulski. He gave him a wristwatch as a gift for courage and heroism. 4 of the 9 widows sued the defense ministry for 1 million rubles each in compensation, about $37,000. The regional governor of Murmansk Oblast offered them 10,000 rubles each instead, about $330. The captain who had ordered the towing operation, despite the bad weather forecast, was charged with criminal negligence. The admiral who oversaw the Northern Fleet was removed from his position by President Putin. The submarine is still there. In 2014, a joint Russian-Norwegian scientific expedition surveyed the wreck and found that the reactors had not yet leaked. In 2020, Vladimir Putin signed a draft order for the K-159 to be raised at an estimated cost of $330 million. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. Norway, which had been the main international partner on Arctic nuclear cleanup, suspended all cooperation. The plan to raise the submarine has not been mentioned in any official Russian source for years. The K-159 is one boat. There are dozens more. Some were scuttled deliberately, like the K-27, sunk off the Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya in 1981 with a damaged reactor inside, sealed with a coating that was only meant to last until 2032. Some sank by accident, like the Komsomolets, lost in the Norwegian Sea in 1989, with 2 nuclear warheads still on board, and dozens more are simply tied up at piers and in coves, slowly settling into the silt of the Arctic. The Russian government calls this its floating Chernobyl. They have been calling it that for decades. Norway, Sweden, the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, all of them have, at various points, put money and engineers into the cleanup. They have made some progress. They have not made enough. Nobody is in a hurry to move them. So these are 7 graveyards, a Turkish beach where cruise ships die in pieces, a Lithuanian forest where 10,000 men dug holes by hand for a war that never came, a Ukrainian antenna that listened for the apocalypse and was killed by the wrong kind of explosion, a German forest where Soviet soldiers raised their children next to nuclear warheads their own allies did not know about, an Albanian countryside with a bunker for every 4th citizen, a Bosnian mountain with a $6 billion hole in the middle of it, and an Arctic bay with 9 men in a metal tube 200 meters down. The Cold War never went hot, but it left its corpses anyway. Some of them are concrete, some of them are steel. Some of them are 9 men in a submarine that nobody can afford to raise. They are all still there. Nobody is in a hurry to move them.